Once upon a time, the land was considered sacred, and native peoples of North America viewed themselves as children of the Wakin Tankin, the great spirit that created all living things. The Sioux, among the main tribes that inhabited the Great Plains region, stood out for their social structure and bravery in combat. The Sioux ancestors reached the forest of north-central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin from the Mississippi River shortly before 800 AD. By 1300 AD, they had embraced the hallmarks of a tribal society and became known as the Seven Council Fires. The Sioux made up a confederation of several tribes that spoke three different dialects: the Lakota dialect, the Dakota dialect, and the Nakota dialect. The Lakota consisted of 7 tribal groups and were the largest of the 3 groups, occupying land in South and North Dakota. The Dakota lived mainly in Minnesota and Nebraska, while the smallest of the 3 groups, the Nakota, resided mostly in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. The Sioux were a prideful people with a rich heritage. They were rulers of North American plains and grasslands, feared by other tribes from the Great Lakes region to the Rocky Mountains. They settled in western Minnesota, establishing a nomadic lifestyle on the plains. They used horses extensively, animals originally brought to the Americans by the Spanish in the 16th century. Their main source of food was buffalo meat. To assist in the buffalo hunt, the Sioux lived in tents that allowed them to move quickly and keep up with the annual migration of buffalo herds. While the Sioux were known as great warriors, the family was seen as the center of Sioux life. Children were called Wakanshin, which meant sacred being, and they were the center of their care. While monogamy was most practiced, Sioux men could marry more than one wife if he proved able to support them. The male and female roles were clearly defined, with men responsible for supporting and defending the family. Hunting was very seriously regarded, and infractions of hunting rules could lead to the offender suffering the razing of his tent or other property. The Sioux were deeply attached to spiritual practices. They believed the nature's sacred spirits brought visions and prophecies to help guide human actions. Religious dancing was common among the Sioux, and self-sacrifice rituals, inflicting wounds on themselves, affirmed their identity as warriors. This was also carried out as a sign of mourning for the death of a close relative or tribal chief. One common belief among Sioux communities is that the spirit of the deceased would travel to an afterlife. In traditional beliefs, this spiritual journey was widely believed to begin as soon as funeral procedures were complete, which took 4 days. The grieving family and friends would attend that 4-day wake to follow the spirit to its final resting place. War was another core Sioux principle. Men built their prestige through war, and warfare was reflected in their family's honor. The warriors were called Akachitas, and they mainly fought on horseback, having their main weapons bows and arrows, spears and hatchets. The Sioux Dakota entered an alliance with the French merchants at the end of the 17th century. The French were attempting to gain an advantage in the struggle for the North American fur trade against the English. The first reported encounter between the Sioux and the French occurred when explorers and traders Radisson and Des Groseilliers reached what is now Wisconsin during the winter of 1660. There was another indigenous group that traded with Europeans, the Ojibwe, who inhabited southern Canada's Great Lakes region. The Ojibwe were remarkable for their large population and expansionist tendencies, which led to conflict with neighboring tribes. The Sioux started to resent the Ojibwe trade with the French and other rival tribes, such as the Cree and Assiniboine. Tensions escalated in the 1720s and led to a drawn-out war in 1736. The Dakota Sioux lost their traditional lands around Leech Lake and Mille Lacs when they were forced south along the Mississippi River as a result of the battles. These conflicts within the tribes were also dangerous for European traders, regardless of which side they traded with. They were seen as enemies by the other. Still, trade with the French continued until the latter gave up on North America in 1763. The Europeans repeatedly attempted to create a truce between the warring tribes to protect their interests, but with limited success. As the United States developed into a nation, the American colonization of new lands became more frequent. The Sioux had many of their lands raided, and several peace treaties and negotiations were made and breached. Railways hired poachers in the 19th century to exterminate the buffalo herds to force the tribes onto reservations. As the buffalo almost quickly became extinct, both the Dakota and Lakota were forced to accept reservations set by the Americans in return for the rest of their land. Domestic cattle and corn were given to the Sioux in exchange for buffalo, making the Sioux dependent on the government for access to their basic food. The United States aimed for the treaties to encourage the Sioux to convert their nomadic hunting lifestyle to sedentary farming, as done by Europeans and Americans. By 1858, the Dakota Sioux had only a small patch of land along the Minnesota River, with no access to their traditional hunting grounds. They had to rely on treaty payoffs for their survival, often delayed. The enforced lifestyle change and vastly underpayments from the federal government wreaked financial hardship and increased social strains within the tribes. By 1862, many Sioux were famished and tensions peaked in the 1862 Dakota War. The first major showdown occurred in 1854 near Fort Laramie in Wyoming, where 19 American soldiers were killed. In retaliation, American troops killed about 100 Sioux at their camp in Nebraska in 1855 and arrested their chief. In 1866, the Red Clouds War was fought and ultimately ended in a treaty that granted the region known as the Black Hills in perpetuity to the Sioux. But the treaty was not honored by the United States in the 1870s. Gold miners swarmed into the region. Helpless and with no hope for a better fortune, the Sioux and other tribes formed the largest Indian camp ever seen by white men. Around 10,000 Indians, divided between men and women and children, tried to subsist in a place inadequate for all the families. Tired of the incessant harassment and violent retaliation, two tribal chiefs, the famous Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, managed to get the support of Sioux warriors and their allies. This led to a series of Indian attacks on cattle ranches and small towns owned by the American colonists. The American government appointed Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, under the command of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, to fight the Sioux and suppress the Indian attacks. Custer was known and hated by the Indians of several tribes already. He had a habit of attacking Indian camps when the warriors were absent and then murdered women and children. The ensuing fight became known as the Battle of Little Bighorn and went down in the history of the American West Conquest. The Battle of Little Bighorn took place on June 25, 1876. The fight was a crushing victory for the Lakota Sioux and their northern Cheyenne and Arapaho allies. The 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men, suffered a major defeat. 5 of the 12 companies on the 7th Cavalry were wiped out, and Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers, a nephew and a brother-in-law. Custer's body was found with 2 bullet wounds, one in his left chest and one in his left temple. Either wound would have been fatal, even though he appeared to have only bled from his chest wound. Some scholars believe that his head wound could have been caused after death. It is possible that, upon receiving a gunshot wound, Custer committed suicide to avoid capture and subsequent torture. After this battle, the Sioux split into multiple groups. The American troops' massacre of an estimated 150 to 370 Sioux men, women, and children in December 1890 heralded the end of the Sioux resistance against the American Army. Throughout the 20th and 21st century, Sioux descendants had continued to fight in courts for the right to remain in their homelands. They had asked for compensation for the abuses and crimes committed by American troops in the past. As of 2018, compensation totaled over $1 billion. However, the Sioux declined payment, demanding the return of their land. Today, the Sioux uphold many separate tribal governments, scattered across several reservations in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana. The Sioux are living a modernized lifestyle that bears scant resemblance to their ancient nomadic ways, but the fact they are part of one of the most powerful and courageous of the North American native nations still remains a source of pride and dignity for their descendants.
They built monumental cities, emerging from the forest trees and verdant hills of Central America. They cultivated a bellicose culture that exalted war as a sacred activity and worshipped dark and savage gods who demanded bloodshed through human sacrifices. Full of mysteries and intriguing stories, the Maya civilization was the largest and most powerful of the pre-Columbian civilizations, appearing around 2600 BC and reaching its zenith between the 8th and 9th centuries. They occupied the areas that today encompass southeastern Mexico and northern Central America. This area included the entire Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Belize, as well as the western parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Thanks to their mastery of agriculture, the early inhabitants of Mesoamerica settled in sedentary agricultural societies, their main source of food being the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash. Among other cultures that adopted the agricultural lifestyle, such as the Olmecs, Mixtecs, and Aztecs, the Maya stood out for their rapid territorial expansion. The history of the Maya civilization is divided into 3 main periods: the pre-classic, classic, and post-classic periods. During the pre-classic period, between 2000 BC and 250 AD, small villages began to grow and form cities. The political system was also constituted in a theopolitical form, that is, the belief that the king and other members of the kingship had divine descent and total authority over their subjects. The authority vested in the ruler was enormous, to the extent that the king exercised ultimate control over the administrative, economic, judicial, and military functions of politics, with his authority reinforced by public displays, rituals, and religion. The population's devotion to the ruler allowed the mobilization of hundreds of people in the execution of huge infrastructure projects and the construction of solid, detailed buildings. As the population increased, different sectors of society became more specialized, and political organization became more complex. Hundreds of cities became connected in a web of political hierarchies. The wealthy segment of society multiplied, with the development of a middle class consisting of artisans, priests, merchants, and soldiers. The Mayan calendar system originated in the pre-classical period and was developed to its maximum sophistication, registering the lunar and solar cycles, eclipses, and movements of the planets with great precision. The Mayan calendar was intrinsically associated with religious rituals and astronomy. The Mayan made meticulous observations on celestial bodies, registering the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Although astronomy was primarily used by the priesthood to understand time cycles and project them into the future to produce prophecies, it also had some practical purposes, such as helping with planting and harvesting crops. During the classical period, between 250 and 900 AD, the Mayan reached the peak of large-scale construction and urbanism, achieving important intellectual and artistic development. The political organization of the classical period has been compared to that of classical Greece, with several city-states in a complex network of alliances and enmities. The largest cities had populations of 50,000 to 120,000 people. Some of these strong cities fought violent wars with each other, as was the legendary rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul. Both cities developed deep systems of alliances and vassals. Smaller cities that joined one of these networks gained prestige by their association with the capital city. This political context can be compared to feudal Japan of the Sengoku Jidai era. Founded in the 3rd century in what is now Guatemala, Tikal was the largest city in the Maya Empire and the capital of a conquering state that became one of the most powerful kingdoms of the ancient Maya. The sovereignty of Tikal was challenged by the also great city of Teotihuacan. The latter, around 378 AD, decisively subdued the rulers of Tikal, founding a new dynasty. There were also other sites with remarkable architecture and sculptures, such as the city of Chichen Itza in the Mexican state of Yucatan. Chichen Itza was one of the largest Mayan cities and may have had the most diverse population in the Maya world, a factor that contributed to its different architectural styles. During the classical period, the Mayan made progress in the study of mathematics and made official a writing system based on hieroglyphics. The Mayan writing system is one of the greatest achievements of the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Americas, considered the most sophisticated and developed out of a dozen writing systems developed in Mesoamerica. Warfare was prevalent in the Mayan world. Military campaigns were organized for several reasons, including control of trade routes and tributes, raids to capture prisoners, and even the complete destruction of an enemy state. Mayan kings led as war captains, but if defeated, they could be captured, tortured, and sacrificed. Mayan states did not maintain standing armies, but any adult male was fit for military service. Warriors were highly disciplined and participated in regular training exercises, which included combat, strategy, and war dances. Some native chronicles suggest that women occasionally battled as well. The Mayan religion was based on the belief in a supernatural realm, inhabited by several powerful deities. Most were cruel and violent in nature, constantly needing to be pampered with ceremonial and ritual offerings. For the Mayan, the gods were the personified forces of nature, and could command rain, wind, fire, and other natural elements. The belief in supernatural forces influenced Mayan life, including the simplest daily activities such as food preparation, trade, politics, and elitist activities. Mayan deities govern all visible and invisible aspects of the world. Dead ancestors were also worshipped, who were thought to be able to intercede for their living descendants in relations with the supernatural realm. Families buried their dead in the soil, with offerings appropriate to the family's social status. As Mayan society developed and the elite became more powerful, the royalty developed their domestic shrines in their Great Pyramids, which came to shelter the tombs of their ancestors. The most important Mayan rituals culminated in human sacrifice. Blood was considered a potent source of nourishment for the deities, and the sacrifice of a living creature was an important blood offering. Generally, only high-status prisoners of war were sacrificed. Captives of lower status were used for labor. Sacrificing an enemy king was the most valued act. The sacrifice involved beheading the captive ruler. But this sometimes only happened after the victim had been tortured, beaten, scalped, burned, or disemboweled in various ways. Heart extraction, while the victim was still alive, was also a common practice, influenced by the rites of the Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico. The Mayans expressed their religious beliefs and other aspects of society in art, preferring the color green or blue-green. They placed great value on jade stones, carving sculptures and funerary masks that could weigh up to 4 kilograms. The Mayans had a long tradition of painting murals. The walls were covered with plaster, and polychrome designs were painted on the smooth finish. Most of these murals had not survived, but painted tombs have been excavated in Tikal and other locations. Among the best preserved murals was a series of life-size paintings at the archaeological site of Bonampak. The post-classic period lasted from 950 to 1539 AD, characterized by the abandonment of the major cities of the classical period. No single theory is universally accepted to explain this collapse of Mayan society, but there were probably several causes, including wars, overpopulation, and severe environmental degradation, which led to the drying up of the main water sources that supplied the cities. Mass migrations considerably altered the landscape of the Maya world. Entire cities became empty and were rarely repopulated. Most of the population headed for higher ground, building new, smaller cities on hilltops where the geography of the terrain allowed for greater protection against enemy attacks. The Mayan world was further impacted by the arrival of the Spanish in 1511, when a Spanish caravel sank in the Caribbean, and about a dozen survivors landed on the coast of Yucatan. They were captured by a Mayan lord, and most were sacrificed. From 1517 to 1519, 3 Spanish expeditions explored the Yucatan coast and fought several battles with the Mayan inhabitants. Even the brave Mayan warriors could not rival the military superiority of the Spanish, who had firearms, cannons, armor, and steel swords. The main Mayan cities were captured and plundered by the Spanish, whose great intent was to find gold to enrich their coffers. Noypeten was the last independent Mayan city to fall into the hands of the Spanish in 1697. Although the Spanish conquest weakened the Mayan culture, it was not extinguished. Mayan beliefs and language have stood the test of time. The 260-day ritual calendar is still in use in modern Mayan communities in the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas, where millions of Mayan speakers inhabit the territory where their ancestors developed their civilization.
Centuries before the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, North America was inhabited by countless indigenous tribes, most of who led a semi-nomadic lifestyle, roaming from one region to another in quest of new hunting grounds and gathering fruits and roots. Over time, however, population growth led to conflicts between the tribes for the best hunting grounds, which often ended in violent battles. Nevertheless, even at such a distant time, democracy had already taken root in North America. Known as the Iroquois Confederacy, this League of Nations emerged among the 5 tribes of the northeastern forest that had been tormented by retaliatory wars and violence for many generations. The Iroquois originally lived near Lake Ontario and along the Mohawk River in New York State. Around 1600, 5 tribes, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, came together to form a confederation A sixth tribe, the Tuscarora, joined in 1722. There were other tribes that spoke in a similar language, but were not part of the Confederation. In 1650, the Iroquois started making their way to the state of Ohio, between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. They conquered and chased out several groups of Native Americans living in the area. Resulting conflicts were known as the Beaver Wars, as the Iroquois wanted more land to hunt and capture beavers and deer. While the tribes began to work together, they surely did not renounce war. They fought and captured other native tribes, as well as waves of European immigrants arriving on the new continent. They fought against the early French and British settlers. The Iroquois took part in the fur trade with the Dutch and then the British. Unlike many other tribes east of the Mississippi River, the Iroquois generally disliked the French and usually traded their hunting spoils with the English. A small group converted to Catholicism and helped the French, but the majority of the Iroquois helped the English during the so-called French and Indian War. As was fairly typical of northeastern Indians before colonization, the Iroquois dwelled in large communal houses known as malocos, made of saplings and covered with elm bark, each sheltering many families. The Maloka family was the basic unit of traditional Iroquois society and provided a form of social organization. Agriculture was the main food source, and the women had a specific role, as they were thought to be connected to the land's power to generate life. For this reason, women were responsible for determining how food would be distributed within the community. Iroquois society was matrilineal. When a marriage took place, the groom and his family relocated to the bride's home, and the family line was traced back to her. War was important in Iroquois society. For men, self-respect depended on achieving personal glory in war. Prisoners of war were often enslaved or otherwise adopted to replace dead family members. Battle losses and disease heightened the need for prisoners, who became a significant population in Iroquois settlements by the late 17th century. During the American Revolution, the Iroquois sought to stay neutral first. Pushed to join one side or the other, some tribes such as the Tuscarora and the Oneida sided with the colonists, while the Mohawk and Seneca remained loyal to Britain, with whom they had stronger relations. In 1779, George Washington commandeered the Sullivan Expedition, led by Colonel Daniel Brodhead and General John Sullivan, against the Iroquois nations to not only invade but to destroy the British Indian Alliance. They torched many Iroquois villages throughout western New York, and the surviving Indians moved to Canada. The American Revolution wreaked great division among the colonists that also caused a rupture in the Iroquois Confederacy. The diseases brought by the Europeans dwindled the Iroquois population to a fraction of what it had been in the past. Hundreds of years of coexistence between the tribes and the collective government were superseded by the sheer immensity of the American Revolutionary War. By the end of the war, the fear that the colonists would fail to honor the pleas of the Iroquois became a reality, especially after the majority decided to stand with the British and were no longer considered reliable by the newly independent Americans. The Canadian Iroquois communities in Oka and Kanawake became flourishing settlements in the 19th century, supporting themselves by farming and selling sleds, snowshoes, boats, and baskets. Iroquois society would prove to be the most persistent military threat that European settlers could face. Though the conquering of their territories forced them to relinquish much of their land, their legacy remains. Some historians assign some aspects of the United States Constitution to the Iroquois' ideas. The Iroquois Confederacy laid out a model of federalism, separation of powers, and participatory democracy that would inspire leaders such as Benjamin Franklin and James Madison during the formation of the United States.
The Inca civilization developed and thrived in some of the most inhospitable places on Earth. At the highest points, the air is so thin that it is difficult to breathe. Earthquakes and volcanoes were also part of the difficulties overcome by the Incas, making them quite skilled in the art of survival. The Incas formed the largest empire in pre-Columbian South America. Located mainly in the Andes Mountains, the empire encompassed present-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, and a large part of Chile, as well as the most southwestern tip of Colombia. The official language of the Inca Empire was Quechua, mainly spoken by indigenous peoples of South America. It predates the Inca Empire and is still spoken today by about 10 million people in different ethnic groups. Even without using the wheel, draft animals, iron metallurgy, and a writing system, the Incas managed to maintain one of the largest imperial states in history. Their architecture was monumental, with an extensive network of roads that reached every corner of the empire. They were also responsible for great agricultural innovations, which allowed food production in a difficult environment. In the Quechua language, the word Inca means ruler, a small ruling class of approximately 40,000 individuals. These ruled over a population of about 10 million people from different ethnic groups. The Spanish adopted the term Inca to designate all subjects of the empire, not just the ruling class. The origin of the Incas is shrouded in myths and legends that may contain some historical truth. Legend has it that the first Inca ruler was Manco Cápac, a semi-legendary king and founder of the Kingdom of Cusco and the Inca lineage, to which all subsequent rulers would have some blood or spiritual connection. Around 1438, the Incas began a vast expansion under Pachacuti, conquering the present-day territory of Peru. Pachacuti reorganized the Kingdom of Cusco, and it is believed that he built the famous city of Machu Picchu in the eastern mountains of southern Peru. It is one of the country's major tourism attractions today. The Inca rule was established mostly in political negotiations. Pachacuti sent messages to the leaders of many villages, extolling the benefits of being part of his empire. He gave them lavish gifts, such as high-quality fabrics, and promised that they would be materially richer as his subjects. Most accepted the rule of the Incas, as the other option was subjugation by force. The leaders who refused were defeated in battle and executed without mercy. The families of some were spared, and their children taken to Cusco, where they learned the Inca systems of administration to later rule their native lands. The Incas referred to their empire by the name Tawantinsuyu, which means the four provinces, due to the territorial divisions of the empire. The four corners of the provinces met each other in Cusco, which had a similar role to a modern federal district. The separation of the provinces was probably created around 1460 during the reign of Pachacuti. The great leader Pachacuti had a son named Tupac Inca Yupanqui, who also became an important military leader. He was responsible for expanding the Inca Empire to Ecuador and Colombia, defeating the also strong Kingdom of Timor, which previously dominated these territories. According to some historians, male and female roles were considered equal in Inca society. Women were sometimes allowed to own land and herds, as inheritance was passed down through the maternal and paternal side of the family. Men and women shared daily chores, caring for children, weaving, cooking, preparing fields for cultivation, and building houses. They also shared the herding of llamas and alpacas, the only large animals available for domestication in those lands. They were also a source of meat, milk, and warm wool for winter. The Incas' religious beliefs encompass several rite faiths based on a mythological system that influence all aspects of life, including work, festivities, and ceremonies. They were polytheistic and worshipped local and regional deities. They believed in reincarnation after death and imagined the next world as an earthly paradise with fields full of flowers and snow-capped mountains. For the Incas, death by fire or incineration of the corpse was taboo. Burning the body would cause the life force to disappear and threaten the passage of the deceased to the next world. This may have given rise to the custom of burying the dead in remote and hardly accessible places. Often, bodies were buried at high altitudes, such as on slopes or mountaintops. The climate of various sites chosen by the Incas to bury their dead allowed in some cases for their natural mummification of the bodies. Some specimens were found in highly preserved states, retaining facial features, hair, clothing, and even internal organs. The mummies found were mostly children, which revealed the cruelty of the Inca world. This proved that human sacrifices were often made, aiming to appease the wrath of the gods. La Doncella is one of the most famous Inca mummies, a 15-year-old girl who died supposedly in her sleep. Architecture was the most important Inca art. The most notable example is Machu Picchu, built by Inca engineers. The main Inca structures were made with stone blocks, whose fit was so perfect that a knife could not be inserted into the masonry. These constructions survived for centuries without the use of mortar to support them. Inca calendars were strongly attached to astronomy. Inca astronomers recorded the equinoxes, the solstices, and the cycle of the planet Venus, but they could not predict eclipses as happened in the Mayan calendar. The Inca calendar was essentially lunisolar. 2 calendars were kept in parallel, one solar and one lunar. The Inca army was the strongest at the time. Any villager or farmer could be recruited as a soldier by virtue of the compulsory public service system. Any Inca physically fit and old enough to fight had to go to war. At the height of the empire, each section contributed to the formation of an army. The Incas had no iron or steel. Their weapons were basically composed of stones and wood. The most sophisticated were produced with copper or bronze. With such rudimentary equipment, the Incas could do little against the Spanish invasions that began in 1528. In July 1529, the Queen of Spain signed a letter that allowed the Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, to begin an expedition to conquer Peru and subdue the Incas. The goal was to sack the cities and seize the reserves of natural resources and gold pieces. The Spanish invaders carried with them new diseases such as influenza, smallpox, typhus, and measles. The Incas had few natural defenses against these, and a great epidemic spread throughout the Inca cities, killing thousands of people. The Incas themselves entered a civil war over the right of succession to the throne, which further weakened the empire. In November 1532, Francisco Pizarro captured Atahualpa, the last Inca emperor. Atahualpa was imprisoned and forced to collaborate with the Spanish. He gave the Spaniards enough gold to fill the room where he was imprisoned, and twice that amount in silver. Atahualpa kept his promise during a rescue attempt, but Pizarro tricked him into refusing to release the Inca after he received the fortune. The Spanish executed Atahualpa, and the Inca Empire began to disintegrate. Many ethnic groups ruled by the Incas welcomed the Spanish invaders as liberators and established alliances with them to share dominance of the resources and mine the land. In 1572, the last Inca fortress was conquered, and the last ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed. This ended the resistance to the Spanish conquest under political authority of the Inca state. When Pizarro and the Spanish subjugated and controlled the continent, they forcibly converted many to Christianity, claiming to have educated them according to the one true religion. The Spanish colonial officials brutally enslaved the natives. One member in each family was forced to work in the gold and silver mines. The epidemics brought by the Europeans devastated the Inca people and their culture. Today, the descendants of the Incas live in the Andes and make up almost half of the Peruvian population, whose traditions maintain the pride of having once formed a mighty empire.
The Navajo were one of the major indigenous nations of North America. They mainly inhabited the southwestern United States, which today includes the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and adjacent portions of California, Colorado, Nevada, Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. The Navajo are believed to have initially migrated from Western Canada, where they belonged to a group of Native Americans called the Athabascans. According to researchers, some Athabascan groups arrived in the American Southwest around the year 1300 of the Common Era. Some Athabascans settled in southern Arizona and New Mexico, making up the different Apache and Navajo tribes. The Navajos' religious beliefs claim that their origins stemmed from 3 underground worlds, and that they traveled through these using different colors, black, blue, and yellow, until they reached the luminous world, where they emerged in the La Plata Mountains in southwestern Colorado. For the Navajo, the gods created the 4 sacred mountains, Blanca Peak and Hesperus Peak in Colorado, Mount Taylor in New Mexico, and the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona. These were supernatural boundaries within which everything was safe and secure. In addition, the gods also established 4 rivers, which acted as defensive gatekeepers. One of these was the San Juan, which played an important role in some of the Navajo myths and acted as a demarcation line in the Navajo territories. The Navajos' interactions with other indigenous peoples, such as the Pueblo tribe of the southwestern United States, were recorded in the 17th century. At that time, refugees from the Pueblos joined the Navajo following the Spanish suppression of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. The rebellion temporarily pushed the Spanish back into Mexico, but in 1693, the Spanish reconquered the Rio Grande Valley area. The Spanish arrival also brought new livestock to the Navajo, such as sheep, goats, and horses. The Navajo were highly adaptable and included domestic animal husbandry and agriculture in their subsistence system. They also adopted horses and, like other tribes, used them as a means of transportation or as mounts in battle. The artistic influences of the Pueblos led the Navajo people to adopt painted pottery and weaving. Rugs made by the Navajo are particularly delicate examples of their art. Another important Navajo artistic tradition was the creation of silver jewelry, probably learned from Mexican blacksmiths. The Navajo learned everything they could from other peoples and used this in their society. This adaptability allowed the Navajo to become the largest and most widespread tribe in the Southwest. Although the Navajo fought bravely to defend their territories against the Spanish, Mexican, and American invaders, they cannot be considered a warrior tribe. Regardless of their bravery, their lack of political integrity was always an obstacle to military organization. They never had a defined tribal chief, and their many leaders never commanded more than a small number of followers. Manuelito, elected chief in 1855 at the conference with Governor Meriwether to negotiate a treaty, probably had more followers than any other Navajo in historical times. With their vast population, the American subjugation of the Southwest would have been much more difficult than it was if the Navajo had the insatiable bellicose urge of the Apache. In 1864, thousands of Navajo surrendered to American soldiers and made the long walk to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where they lived on a reservation under horrific conditions. The Navajo Reservation was established with the signing of the 1868 treaty, when they were finally allowed to return to their homeland. Since then, the Navajo Reservation has expanded significantly to 27,000 square miles. During World War II, the Navajo played a very important role within the American troops. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, American Major Howard Connor, a signal officer with the 5th Marine Division, stated, "If it wasn't for the Navajo, the Marines would never have conquered Iwo Jima." Connor had 6 Navajo code talkers working around the clock for the first 2 days of the battle. These 6 Navajos sent and received over 800 messages, all without error. Navajo coders took part in every U.S. Marine assault in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. They served in the 6 Marine divisions, Marine battalions, and Marine parachute units, broadcasting messages by telephone and radio in their native language, a code the Japanese could never break to understand the attack coordinates. Today, the Navajo Nation has the largest land area held by a Native American tribe in the USA. Unlike many tribes, the Navajo has managed to keep their cultural heritage alive. Over 97% of the adults still speak the Navajo language, and many members of the nation speak fluent English. Some continue to practice ancient religious and ceremonial forms, preserving the glorious history of the Navajo people.
Renowned for their architectural wonders and monumental cities, their brutal warriors, and bloody rituals, the Aztecs established a gigantic empire that bloomed in the very center of what is now Mexico. The origins of the Aztec peoples are clouded in many mysteries and legends. Historians found evidence that sometime around 1065 AD, there occurred a mass migration of several indigenous tribes towards the Valley of Mexico. Their exact reasons remain a mystery, but their answers may lie in an ancient legend passed down from generation to generation among the Aztecs. The legend said that once upon a time, 7 different tribes lived in a place called Chicomotztoc, the place of the 7 caves. They all shared the same language, which later became known as the Nawa language. For unexplained reasons, the tribes began a major migration and settled in a mythical paradise called Aztlan, in which all the tribes were able to thrive. The tribes were Xochimilca, Tlahuica, Tlaxcala, Tapaneca, Chalca, and Mexica. For historians, the estimated location of Aztlan would be in northwestern Mexico or the southwestern United States. The people of Aztlan began to call themselves Aztecs, a name in which the Nawa language means people of Aztlan. Gradually, some tribes became more numerous and powerful than others, and a despotic elite ruled the lands and people of Aztlan with an iron fist. To escape their oppressors, some tribes fled Aztlan in search of new territories to colonize, and the Mexica tribe was responsible for spreading Aztec culture, building the main Aztec cities in Mexico. Still, according to legend, in circa 1323, the Mexicas had a sight of an eagle perched on a spiny cactus, devouring a snake. The vision was an indication of the place where they should build their settlement. The Mexicas built the city of Tenochtitlan on a small swampy island in Lake Texcoco, the inner lake of the basin of Mexico. The Mexicas' royal dynasty was chartered when Acampichtl was appointed the first king of Tenochtitlan. Nonetheless, the Mexicas were still subject to the control of the kingdom of the Tapanecas, to whom they were expected to relinquish their warriors and pay tribute. After long years of servitude and steep taxation, the Mexicas allied with other tribes in the region and conducted a violent war against the Tapanecas, who were decimated and their cities captured. Following this victory, Tenochtitlan ultimately became the dominant city-state in the Valley of Mexico. The Mexicas and their allies helped the foundation on which the Aztec Empire was built. The Aztec society was divided by social classes, with the nobility being the most privileged class, with the right to wear particularly elegant garments and consume luxury goods, as well as possessing land and commanding the workforce of the plebes. Most of the powerful nobles were called lords and had ownership control of royal estates or houses. They were allowed to serve in the highest offices in the government or as military leaders. The second social class was formed by the peasants and workers in general, who, by their labor and food production, generated an extremely useful source of income for the city. Certain citizens of the second class did not own land, and, instead, worked directly for a lord of the nobility, thereby securing the right to live on his land. This system was quite similar to the fiefdoms of medieval Europe. In many pre-Columbian peoples, Aztec society was largely modeled on the agriculture of corn. The humid climate in the Valley of Mexico, with its many lakes and swamps, made for intensive farming. The main crops, besides corn, were beans, squash, peppers, and amaranth. Another important method for agricultural production in the valley was the construction of chinampas, which were man-made expanses of farmland created from alternating layers of mud from the lake bottom, vegetable matter, and other vegetation in which could be cultivated throughout the year. As Tenochtitlan became a large urban center, aqueducts brought water to the city from springs on the lake shore, and a system was laid down to collect human waste for use as fertilizer. The infrastructure made Tenochtitlan a city comparable to ancient Rome in sophistication and architectural innovations. As capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan was situated where today's Mexico City is located today. It was built according to a fixed plan and centered on the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, which towered 50 meters high above the city. The temple was dubbed Hueyi Teocalli and was sacred to the gods of war, rain, and agriculture, each of whom had a shrine at the top of the pyramid with separate staircases. The Aztecs were particularly fond of arts and crafts. They highly esteemed artistic endeavors as a sign of intellectuality. The fine arts covered writing and painting, singing and composing poetry, carving sculptures, and producing mosaics. Some craftspeople were devoted to making fine ceramics, manufacturing intricate plumage for warriors and nobles, and working metals, including copper and gold. The Aztecs used two simultaneous calendars, a 260-day ritual calendar and a 365-day solar calendar. Each day had a name and a number in both calendars. The 2 days combined once in 52 years. The monthly rituals took place in the entire population, as the ceremonies were performed in each house, in the temples, and the main sacred enclosure. The Aztec religion was primarily organized around the practicing of rituals dedicated to a pantheon of distinct deities and arranged on specific dates in the calendar. Like the other pre-Columbian peoples, the Aztecs were polytheistic and made religion one of the cornerstones that underpinned their culture. A pivotal feature of their religion was the offering of sacrifices to the deities, as a means of expressing gratitude or payment for the continuation of the cycle of life. Many festivals entail different dance forms, as well as the retelling of mythical narratives by deity impersonators, and sacrifices in the form of food, animals, and human victims. For the Aztecs, death was paramount to the perpetuation of creation, and both gods and humans bore the responsibility of sacrificing themselves to allow life to continue. Humans were regarded as being responsible for the ongoing rebirth of the sun, as well as paying for the earth for its fertility. Whereas human sacrifices were performed by almost all pre-Columbian peoples of Mesoamerica, the Aztecs pushed this custom to an unparalleled level. For the consecration of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in 1487, for example, Aztec and Spanish sources reported that 80,000 prisoners were sacrificed over 4 days. This figure is deemed by many scholars to be exaggerated, but other estimates put the number of human sacrifices at between 20,000 victims each year. The empire reached its peak in 1519, just before the appearance of a ragtag group of Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés. The Spanish teamed up with the city-states that opposed the Mexicas and embarked on an all-out and violent war against the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. After the downfall of the city on August 13, 1521, and the capture of the Emperor Cuauhtémoc, the Spanish founded Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Following the arrival of the Europeans in Mexico and their successful military campaigns to conquer the Aztec cities, the native populations dwindled dramatically. In large part, this was the outcome of the epidemics of different types of viruses brought to the continent, against which the natives had no immunity. Smallpox outbreaks ravaged the population of Tenochtitlan, a major factor in the city's collapse. As the superstructure of the Aztec Empire was destroyed in 1521, the Spanish exploited the city-states in which the empire was built to control the indigenous populations through their local nobles. Said nobles swore loyalty to the Spanish crown and converted to Christianity, in return for which they were recognized as nobility by the Spanish crown. Nobles acted as brokers to levy taxes and harness labor for their new lords, helping establish Spanish colonial rule. For the 19th century, the portrayal of Aztecs as uncivilized barbarians was superseded by romanticized versions, with a high-developed culture that rivaled the ancient European civilizations. The Aztec culture and history were foundational to the formation of the Mexican national identity. To this day, one of Mexico's main military coats of arms features a golden eagle sitting perched on a spiny cactus and devouring a rattlesnake. The depiction is ingrained in the legend where the Aztec people would know where to build their city by spotting an eagle eating a snake on top of a cactus. The image has been an early symbol of Mexican politics and culture for centuries. At its zenith, the Aztec culture had a complex and rich mythological and religious tradition, as well as impressive architectural and artistic achievements. The heritage of the Aztecs resonates in Mexico today in many forms. Archaeological sites are dug up and open to the public, and their artifacts are exhibited in museums with pride. Aztec place names and words still permeate the vocabulary of Mexicans, thereby continuing to keep alive the memories of these remarkable people.
The region known as the Great Plains, stretching east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States and Canada, has been home to many different Indian tribes, with each of its own particularities and traditions. Among the different North American tribes, the Comanche Nation was one of the most active and powerful. They inhabited the territories that today comprise of north-central Texas, eastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, and western Oklahoma. The Spanish colonizers called the historic territory the Comancheria. Originally, the Comanches were part of a group of tribes known as the Eastern Shoshone, who lived mainly in the Wyoming region and shared the same language and customs. The Shoshone kept a very similar lifestyle to that of the ancient hunters and gatherers of prehistoric times, living as nomads and without notable military might. This was bound to change. With the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors around the year 1500, the Europeans had brought firearms, and particularly horses, to the American continent, which brought great changes to the culture of the native peoples. The command of horses gave the Comanche tactical superiority against other neighboring tribes that did not yet have these animals. the Comanche split from the Shoshone with about 10,000 members. They first migrated to the Central Plains before proceeding south to an area that stretched from the Arkansas River to central Texas. As they continued to migrate, the Comanche population increased dramatically due to the plentiful buffalo. Thanks to the horses yet again, they could be hunted down more easily and become the Comanche's primary source of food. As their population grew and a war-based culture developed, the Comanche soon became the most feared warriors in the territory. They were renowned for their savagery in combat and their great skill as horsemen. They were also dreaded for their habit of kidnapping people and mistreating them in a very cruel way, considering their captives as slaves or commodities to be exchanged for furs and horses. The Comanche fought against the Apache and pushed them out of the plains. By the end of the 18th century, the struggle between Comanche and Apache had taken on legendary proportions. In 1784, the governor of Texas, Domingo Cabello, wrote that the Apaches had been defeated on the southern plains in a battle that lasted 9 days, somewhere in northwestern Texas. The Comanche Indians often resorted to night raids against their enemies as a tactic. This was usually on full moon nights, when visibility was better, allowing the Comanche to see their routes. This led to the English term Comanche Moon, when the Comanche would attack to capture horses, hostages, and weapons. Unlike other indigenous lineages, such as the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the Comanche never constituted a political unit recognized by all members. They instead divided themselves into self-sufficient tribes, pursuing their economic and political goals. Sharing the same language and culture, they sometimes fought amongst themselves, and other times they were at peace, working together. In the 19th century, they became involved in stealing cattle from settlers in Texas, reselling them in New Mexico. They fought against the Mexicans and European settlers, and many of the other Plains tribes during this period. Having ruled the area of Texas, including northwestern Oklahoma and northeastern New Mexico, the Comanche were so successful in the art of horse taming that they started supplying horses to French and American traders. During the 19th century, the traditional Comanche burial practice was to wrap the body of the deceased in a blanket and lay it on a horse behind the rider. He would then ride off to find a suitable burial place, such as a safe cave. After the burial, the rider would return to the camp, where the bereaved relatives would burn all the deceased belongings. This custom lasted until Christian missionaries coaxed the Comanche to bury their dead in coffins in cemeteries. Also during the 19th century, the Comanche managed to maintain their independence and even increase their territory. Soon, however, this area of prosperity would be gravely affected by a wave of epidemics due to Eurasian diseases, for which the Comanche had no immunity, such as smallpox and measles. Smallpox and cholera outbreaks occurred between 1817 and 1849, had a major impact on the Comanche, whose population dropped from about 20,000 to only 7,000. In the 1860s, the efforts to move the Comanche to a reservation in the Oklahoma Indian Territory began. The American government provided them with churches, schools, and annuities in exchange for a vast expanse of land totaling more than 60,000 square miles. The Americans also promised to stop the buffalo hunters, who were decimating the large herds on the plains, under the condition that the Comanche, along with the Apache, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, would leave their land. But the government did not stop the slaughter of herds, and the Comanche fought back by attacking a hunting party in Texas. This conflict became known as the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. The attack was a disaster for the Comanche, and the United States Army was called in during the Red River War to suppress the remaining Comanche in the area, forcefully removing them to the Indian reservation. In just 10 years, the buffalo were on the brink of extinction, essentially ending the Comanche way of life as hunters. In May 1875, the last free Comanche group surrendered and moved to the Fort Sill Reservation in Oklahoma. The 1890 census revealed that there were only 1,598 Comanche on the Fort Sill Reservation. During World War II, many Comanche left the traditional tribal lands in Oklahoma, looking for jobs and further opportunities in the Californian cities. About half of the Comanche population still lives in Oklahoma, with the rest scattered throughout Texas, California, and New Mexico. These days, many Comanches from all over the United States meet in annual gatherings to celebrate their heritage and culture. The Cheyenne are Native American tribes that speak a language of Algonquian origin that was widely used by different tribes from the east coast of North America to the Rocky Mountains. They were intimately connected with other tribes, such as the Arapaho and the Gros Ventre, fostering connections with the Lakota Sioux. The Cheyenne were among the most prominent tribes of the plains, living and hunting mainly in the hills and prairies along the Missouri and Red Rivers. They called themselves Tasistists, a name which is translated in many different ways and may mean equal people or our people. Originally, the Cheyenne lived in the Great Lakes area of Minnesota and on the Missouri River, where they homesteaded in earth-covered log houses, in permanent settlements, cultivated corn and pumpkins, hunted wild animals, harvested wild rice, and made pottery. By the late 1600s, however, they began a westward migration, most likely due to competition and conflict with the Ojibwe, Arikara, and Mandan Indians. As migrating to the southwest, their lifestyle shifted to that of nomadic hunters and gatherers. In the 1700s, the Cheyenne took over horses brought by the Spanish and became skilled buffalo hunters. Nevertheless, conflicts against their Sioux enemies eventually pushed the Cheyenne further into the plains, who, in turn, pushed the Kiowas tribe further south. In 1832, the Cheyenne broke up into two groups, one inhabiting the Platte River near the Black Hills, and the other living near the Arkansas River further south in Colorado. Those who relocated to the Arkansas River eventually came into contact with the Kiowas and their Comanche allies. Several fierce battles occurred between them until 1840, at which time an alliance was formed with the Kiowa, Apache, and Comanche tribes. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, the first Cheyenne territory was established in northern Colorado, comprising the present-day sites of Fort Collins, Denver, and Colorado Springs. A signed peace treaty with the Kiowas allowed the Cheyenne to expand their forays further south. In 1853, they conducted their first raid into Mexico with dire results, having lost most of their warriors in a battle with the Mexicans. As further European and American settlers pushed westward in the 1850s, the Cheyenne, along with their new allies, soon began to rebel against the pioneers as well as the United States Army. Upon the discovery of gold in Colorado, the 1851 treaty was breached, and the territory which had been given to the Cheyenne was taken away. A few Cheyenne warriors raided at least 3 groups of emigrant settlers. A combined army of 400 American soldiers headed east across the plains in search of the Cheyenne to punish them for their crimes. Influenced by a healer named White Bull, the Cheyenne took to the battle believing spiritual medicine would prevent the American soldiers' guns from firing. The Cheyenne encircled the approaching troops as they followed near the Solomon River. American officer Edwin Sumner commandeered a cavalry charge, and the troops charged forward with drawn sabers. While the Cheyenne were forced to flee, it was the first battle that the Cheyenne fought against the United States Army. The American troops pressed on and 2 days later burned a Cheyenne camp and obliterated the living quarters and the winter supply of buffalo meat. This prompted what became known as the Colorado War of 1864 to 1865. The Cheyenne people were forced to move to a reservation in Oklahoma, where yet another conflict took place in the early morning hours of November 27, 1868. After experiencing a number of miscommunications, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the 7th United States Cavalry in a raid on a peaceful Cheyenne encampment. Native revenge was to come during the Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, when the Cheyenne, along with the Lakota Sioux and a small band of Arapaho, wiped out the army of George Custer, who was also killed during the conflict. The battle became known as the greatest victory of the Native American Indians, as 262 soldiers died in the battle, while only about 60 Indian warriors were killed. Following the Battle of Little Bighorn, there were further efforts to force the Cheyenne onto a reservation in Indian Territory. In 1877, nearly 1,000 Northern Cheyenne were forcibly marched to Oklahoma, where they found conditions appalling, with many falling ill and dying of malaria. Unable to adjust to the hot climate, the Northern Cheyenne fled back north, led by Chief Blind Knife and Little Wolf in 1878. In 1884, an executive order created a reservation for the Northern Cheyenne in southeastern Montana. These days, the Cheyenne hold 2 reservations, one in Tongue River, Montana, where about 6,500 people reside. The other reservation, in southwestern Oklahoma, consists of about 11,000 members and shared with their longtime allies, the Arapaho. Allies who for decades have fought together for the right to keep their way of life. The North American indigenous nations and tribes played a key role in the United States' founding history. While many indigenous cultures took a significant part during the period of colonization of the Wild West, few can claim to play as an important part as the Apache Indians. The Apache Indians were rabid warriors who refused to give up their land despite the mounting odds against them. The Apaches are a group of culturally related Native American tribes in the southwestern United States. They are distant relatives of the Navajo, with whom they share the Athabascan languages spoken throughout the western United States. Historically, the Apache homelands contained areas that now correspond to eastern Arizona, northern Mexico, New Mexico, western Texas, and southern Colorado. These areas are known collectively as Apacheria. The early Apaches were a nomadic people, covering a wide area of the United States, wandering as far south as Mexico. They were primarily hunters and gatherers, with some groups hunting buffalo and others engaging in limited farming. The Apache lived in two kinds of traditional homes, the wickiups and teepees. The wickiup was more of a permanent home, its frame made of tree saplings forming a dome covered with bark or grass. The tents, called teepees, were a temporary home that could easily be relocated when the tribe needed to move around to hunt buffalo. To haul their tents and other items when they moved, the Apache used a type of sled called a travois that could be filled with items and then pulled along by dogs. When the Europeans brought horses to the Americas, the Apache started using horses to drag the travois. Since horses were much bigger and stronger, the travois could be larger and carry many more belongings. This also allowed the Apaches to make bigger tents. Traditionally, the warriors did not wear feathered warfare headdresses, although the Plains Apaches adopted their headdresses from their Kiowas friends. Most Apache tribes wore leather or cloth tiaras. Apache people used to wear wooden masks and special headdresses for religious ceremonies. The face paint would depend on the sort of ceremony, and they would differ if they were going into battle. Whenever a tribal chief was chosen, it was done democratically. The Apache's decision to choose their leadership was based on respect for each candidate. If the candidate did not enjoy the respect of many in the tribe, he would lose his position. For the Apache, a strong trust of the tribe's members in their leader was important. The Apache tribes have a steep history of fighting for their territory. They fought against the Spanish and Mexican invaders during the 17th century and the Americans during the 19th century. The bravery of these indigenous warriors are mirrored in the very name by which they are called. The term Apache probably comes from the word Apachu, which means enemy in the Zuni language of the indigenous people who lived west of New Mexico. When the horse and gun trade concentrated in the Central Plains around 1750, Indian raids by formerly nomadic groups, such as the Comanche, increased significantly. The Apaches who lived on the plains were severely pressured by the Comanche and had to retreat to the south and west. Eventually, these displaced Apaches escalated their raids against other Indians and settlers for food and livestock. Apache raids against settlers and migrants crossing their land continued during the westward expansion period of the United States and the acquisition of New Mexico by the United States in 1848. There were three Apache tribes that stood out: the Chiricahua tribe, the Jicarilla tribe, and the Mescalero tribe. The Chiricahua were the Apaches of the Great Mountain, named so after their ancient home in the foothills of southeastern Arizona. They were the most pugnacious of the Arizona Indians. Their raids extended into New Mexico, southern Arizona, and northern Sonora, Mexico. Some of the most notable leaders were Cochise, Naish, and Geronimo. The Jicarilla were one of 6 groups that migrated out of Canada between about 1300 and 1500 AD. Heading south, they settled in the southwest, where their traditional homeland covered more than 50 million acres in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and western Oklahoma. The Mescalero were one of the most vicious Apache groups in the Southwest when defending their homeland. Nomadic hunters and warriors, they moved from place to place riding their wickiups in Texas, Arizona, and Mexico. Between 1700 and 1750, many Mescalero groups were dislodged from the southern plains in central Texas by their Comanche enemies. By this time, they had taken refuge in the mountains of New Mexico, West Texas, and Mexico. In the late 1800s, the Apache fought multiple battles against the United States government. They were trying to fight back against the aggression and conquest of their lands. Several great Apache leaders came into being, such as Cochise and Geronimo. They fought with ferocity for decades, but ultimately had to surrender and were forced to set up reservations. In 1849, gold was discovered in San Francisco, leading to the California Gold Rush. Many American citizens living in the East began to migrate to California. As a result, They would often cross in and out of Apache lands. The tense relationship between the Apaches and the Americans began to turn hostile. These became known as the Apache Wars. When the American Civil War broke out between 1861 and 1865, the westward migration flow was curtailed. However, the Apaches continued to defend their land. They did not choose a side and fought against the Union and Confederate Army because they believed they were encroaching on their land. After the war, the United States breached several treaties they had with the Apaches and continued to drive them off their land. This heralded the beginning of many years of clashes between the United States military forces and the southwestern native peoples. The root causes of the conflict included the Apaches' unwillingness to live on the Indian reservations created by the U.S. government. They were also related to the expansion of gold, silver, and coal mining operations in the Apache territories. The last of the Apache Wars ended in 1886 with the surrender of Apache chief Geronimo and his few remaining followers. The Chiricahua tribe was evicted from the West and held as prisoners of war for 27 years in Florida, Alabama, and Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In 1913, members of the tribe were given the option of taking land plots in Oklahoma or living in New Mexico on the Mescalero Reservation. In a 2000 cultural census carried out in the United States, about 57,000 people identified themselves solely as Apache. Another 40,000 people reported being part Apache. Today, many Apaches live on reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. Farming, ranching, and tourism-related businesses are significant economic activities for these people. Although they live in modern times, they still keep their ancestral beliefs and traditions alive.